I always thought moving to the edge of the desert was my ticket to peace, away from noise, traffic, and bureaucracy. But that illusion shattered the moment a red laser dot danced across the forehead of my prize bull, Thor. The man holding the rifle claimed he was sent by the HOA. I wish I were making this up. My name's Carter Benson, a 34-year-old software engineer who bought 180 acres outside of Wickenford, Arizona to escape the city and pursue something real. I wasn't just playing cowboy, invested every cent I had into raising 15 Texas Longhorn heritage bulls, one of the rarest and most historic cattle breeds in America. These animals weren't just livestock. They were federally recognized heritage animals, living, breathing artifacts of our country's past. Only 300 of their kind remained nationwide, and each of my bulls was valued at around $50,000, but you can't put a price on legacy. I still remember standing beside my father at 10 years old, watching these majestic creatures for the first time on a Texas ranch. This is the real America, he told me. He was a quiet man, a veteran who never made a big show of things, but he understood the value of roots. When he died 5 years ago, I swore I'd carry that spirit forward. That's how I ended up here, surrounded by the dry Arizona wind and the slow, patient movement of a rare breed most people couldn't even name. It was early morning when a white SUV kicked up a cloud of dust down my driveway. Out stepped a woman like someone airlifted in from another world. She looked to be in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, with perfect blonde curls, oversized sunglasses, and a spotless white suit that screamed money and control. I didn't recognize her, but the way she held herself told me everything I needed to know. This was someone who expected obedience, not negotiation. She reached into her purse and pulled out a bottle of designer perfume, spraying it into the air like it would shield her from the earthy scent of livestock. "I'm Clarissa Whitmore," she announced, her voice crisp with practiced authority. "Chairwoman of the Desert Pines, HOA, and these animals of yours. They'll need to go." The way she said animals made it sound like I was keeping wild rats, not federally protected livestock. I stayed calm, resting my arms on the fence as my bulls wandered lazily behind me. "You're on my land," I told her, "and this is where they belong. Every one of these bulls is registered and protected under federal law." I gestured to the tags on their ears and the plaques on each penhard, proof that I wasn't some backyard breeder. But Clarissa didn't even glance at them. "I don't care what paperwork you think you have, Mr. Benson," she sniffed. "Rules are rules. And in this community, I make the rules." Then she turned on her heel and walked back to her car, heels sinking slightly into the dirt. Just before she drove off, she rolled down the window and gave me a tight, cold smile. "You'll come around, one way or another." It didn't take long for the harassment to start. By the next morning, flyers had been dropped throughout the neighborhood with my address in bold red ink and warnings about infected livestock posing a public health risk. There were photos clearly taken by Clarissa showing my bulls grazing peacefully, but accompanied by fear-mongering claims of disease and hazard. By noon, a bewildered county health inspector was standing at my gate. He apologized profusely after reviewing my vet records and certifications, but I could tell this wouldn't be the last visit. Clarissa had activated the full power of her HOA as a personal weapon, and she wasn't done. That weekend, a crew showed up to install a massive white vinyl banner directly across from my gate. It read, "Luxury Neighborhood Cleanup Campaign Protecting Our Property Values." I stood on my porch, arms folded, watching as Clarissa posed next to it, pointing at my cattle like they were a crime scene. She even had the gall to livestream it. That was the last straw. I drove into town and had my own sign printed that declared, "Protected Heritage Livestock Federal Status Recognized by Law." I posted it at my entrance, mounted security cameras around the perimeter, and even hooked up an outdoor speaker to play a rotating announcement. "Welcome to Cattle Country, not a country club." But the universe had its own ideas for justice. The day Clarissa posed next to her banner for Instagram, Thunder, the largest and oldest of my bulls, wandered over to the fence as she aimed her phone for the perfect shot. Thunder lifted his tail and unloaded a stream of urine directly onto the banner, soaking the vinyl with magnificent precision. Clarissa shrieked like she'd been assaulted. I kept a straight face, but I was dying inside. It was the kind of poetic justice you couldn't script. An older neighbor, probably in his 70s, shuffled over and leaned against my fence. "Drove across 3 states once just to see a longhorn like that," he said softly. "Kids these days think hamburger comes from a box. Don't let them erase history." His words dug into me. This fight wasn't just mine anymore. The next morning, a hand-painted sign leaned against my gate. "We stand with the bulls." By noon, there were 4 more. One veteran neighbor dropped off hay with a handwritten note, "Consider this my war bond." The HOA might have had rules, but I had history, and now I had allies. And as I stared down the long road ahead, I knew this wasn't just about property values. It was about the soul of the land itself. The outpouring of community support gave me hope, but I knew Clarissa wasn't the kind of woman to back down quietly. The signs of escalation started subtly. First, it was code enforcement knocking on my door, holding a clipboard and reading, from a vague complaint about environmental concerns. Then came a mysterious water test request from a supposed environmental consultant who wouldn't reveal who hired him. I knew it was her. She was creating a paper trail to justify taking action. I countered by organizing a public tour of the ranch, inviting local historians and agricultural enthusiasts to learn about the bulls. To my surprise, over 40 people showed up, including families, teachers, and veterans. I explained the heritage status of each bull, their links to American frontier history, and why preserving them mattered. A local journalist even showed up and wrote a glowing article about my ranch titled The Last Cowboys of Wickenford. Clarissa must have read it because the next morning she left a voice message on my phone. "Hope you enjoyed your little show," she hissed. "Just remember, I have more influence than you realize." A week later she flexed that influence. I was woken at 6 a.m. by loud mechanical noise. Out my window, a construction crew was operating a street sweeping machine and pressure washer right in front of my gate. When I stepped outside to ask what they were doing, one of the workers said they were conducting mandatory curb restoration per HOA request. But my road was private. There was no curb, just gravel, and certainly nothing that needed restoring. I filmed the entire interaction and sent it to the sheriff's office along with documentation of my property lines. It took them 2 days to respond, and by then, Clarissa had posted photos on the HOA's social media page. Claiming my refusal to maintain standards forced the board to intervene. She was rewriting the story in real time, using fake authority and online spin. That night, my security cameras caught someone tossing dead grass clippings over my fence. The next morning I got an HOA citation for landscape waste contamination. Clarissa wasn't just playing dirty, she was writing the rules mid-game. Still, something changed after the bulls made their surprise appearance at the community center. When Thunder strolled into Clarissa's anti-ranch presentation, the entire narrative shifted. What was supposed to be a fear-driven campaign turned into an internet sensation. Within 24 hours, my livestream had over 200,000 views and thousands of supportive comments. People across the country were outraged that anyone would target federally protected livestock under the guise of HOA regulations. Thunder, with his massive horns and calm demeanor, became an unexpected folk hero. One commenter wrote that bulls got more dignity than every HOA combined. But while Clarissa lost control of the public story, she doubled down behind the scenes. 2 days after the livestream, I got a visit from a man in a suit who introduced himself as Brent Morrissey, a community compliance consultant. He carried a fake badge, a binder of vague ordinances, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're here to help resolve this amicably," he said, but continued resistance could complicate things. I told him the only thing complicating anything was his illegal presence on my property and that I'd be calling the sheriff. He nodded, still grinning, and said, "Clarissa doesn't like to lose. You should think about that." Brent wasn't the last of them. Over the next few days, unmarked cars began appearing outside my property, same vehicles, same tinted windows, never staying too long but always lingering just long enough to remind me they were watching. Tamara, a neighbor who'd brought her kids to the bull tour, showed up one evening looking nervous. They came to my door, she whispered, asked if I'd ever heard your bulls late at night or noticed strange smells. She told them no, of course, but they pressed harder, asking if she'd be willing to sign a statement. They said if I didn't, I might face zoning violations on my home garden, she said, tears in her eyes. I gave her a hug and assured her she wasn't alone, but my anger burned hotter than ever. Clarissa was threatening innocent people now, trying to isolate me by making examples of anyone who stood up for me. It was mob tactics dressed up in HOA lingo. One night around 11 p.m., I heard gravel crunching on my side road. I looked out the window and saw 3 men walking along the edge of the pasture with flashlights. I grabbed my phone, pressed record, and went outside with a high-powered flashlight of my own. "This is private land," I called out. "You're trespassing." One of the men turned, flashing the same smug grin Brent had. "Just inspecting," he said. "We got reports of animal distress." "From who?" I asked. "Your neighbor," he replied. They didn't stay long after I threatened to call the sheriff again, but the message was clear: they were probing for weaknesses. The next day, Clarissa dropped a formal letter in my mailbox on HOA letterhead. It claimed my livestock, violated an obscure no-nuisance animal clause in the Desert Pines Covenant. The problem: Desert Pines ended 3 miles away. My property was never part of the development. I wasn't under her jurisdiction, and she knew it. But Clarissa was hoping to make enough noise that someone in authority wouldn't notice the details. I called an attorney named Max Townsend, who specialized in agricultural property disputes. After reviewing everything, he shook his head and said, "She's building a legal illusion. She doesn't have a case, but if you don't shut it down now, someone's going to believe her long enough to cause you real problems." Max helped me draft a cease and desist letter, citing federal law and property rights. We filed an injunction to prevent any further unauthorized visits and requested a formal investigation into Clarissa's use of HOA funds for her cleanup campaign. The paperwork alone took 2 weeks, during which Clarissa's people continued showing up with clipboards and thin threats. But then something changed. More neighbors began pushing back. One family down the road replaced their HOA flag with one that read, "We support heritage ranchers." A local teacher emailed me asking if she could bring her students to the ranch for a history lesson. The community wasn't just watching, they were waking up. But so was Clarissa. And as Max warned me, a person with power and no boundaries is a dangerous combination. 2 days after we filed the legal papers, I came home to find my gate wide open. The lock had been cut. Thunder and 3 other bulls had wandered onto the outer edge of the pasture near the road. Thankfully, they didn't go far, and I managed to corral them back within an hour. But it wasn't an accident. Someone had done this on purpose. I pulled the security footage. At 2:13 a.m., 2 hooded figures approached the gate with bolt cutters. One of them looked directly at the camera and waved before slicing through the chain. I sent the video straight to the sheriff and to Max. "That's felony trespass and animal endangerment," Max said. "She just crossed the line into criminal territory." I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew what was coming. Clarissa had made her move, and now it was my turn. I called every news outlet that had shown interest in the original story. I uploaded the gate footage to the ranch's social media page with a simple caption, "They came for the bulls last night, this time with bolt cutters." By morning, the video had gone viral. National news picked it up. The tide wasn't just turning, it was crashing down. But I also knew Clarissa wasn't going to quit until someone forced her to, and I was ready to be that someone. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind. The footage of the gate being cut had made its way to a national news station that aired a segment titled "When the HOA Goes Too Far," featuring aerial shots of my ranch, interviews with supportive neighbors, and commentary from a legal analyst who called Clarissa's tactics textbook civil harassment. Clarissa didn't comment publicly at first, but the pressure clearly rattled her. She posted a statement on the HOA's private forum claiming the footage was edited and misleading, suggesting I staged the entire thing for attention. But her credibility was crumbling, and more neighbors were distancing themselves. Some who had previously avoided me out of fear started dropping by the ranch, offering snacks for the bulls, small donations, or just words of encouragement. But even as Clarissa's grip on the neighborhood began to slip, she wasn't finished. On a quiet Thursday morning, I spotted a strange black van parked across from my gate. No decals, tinted windows. It stayed there for hours without anyone getting in or out. That night, I heard what sounded like a drone hovering near the barn. I rushed outside and caught a glimpse of it just before it zipped over the tree line. When I checked my property cameras, they had all been disabled. Someone had jammed the signal. The sheriff's department promised to investigate, but I knew they were overwhelmed and skeptical of how far this was really going. I started to wonder if Clarissa had more than just HOA loyalists behind her. The intimidation was too calculated, too high-tech. Max agreed. He dug deeper into the financials of the HOA and found something bizarre. Over $70,000 in funds had been quietly allocated under community safety initiatives over the past 6 months, more than enough to hire private contractors, legal consultants, and tech surveillance tools. The HOA didn't have that kind of budget unless someone was supplementing it with outside money. That's when Max found a connection between Clarissa and a real estate firm based in Scottsdale. One of the board members, Clarissa's cousin, was also listed as a developer in a proposal to build a high-end residential complex on the outskirts of Wickenford. Guess whose land stood directly in the way of that proposed expansion? Mine. It all clicked. Clarissa's war on my bulls wasn't just about aesthetics or cattle. It was a campaign to devalue my property until I either sold or was forced out, making way for her cousin's shiny new housing development. I felt sick to my stomach, but at the same time more resolved than ever. She wanted a fight. She was about to get one. I organized a community open house that Saturday and invited every local official, every journalist, and every neighbor who had ever doubted my story. I printed out copies of my certifications, Clarissa's threatening letters, screenshots from her social media, and the HOA financial breakdown Max had uncovered. I gave them all a simple folder labeled "The Real Story." The turnout was far beyond anything I imagined. Not just neighbors but residents from nearby towns came out, drawn by curiosity, outrage, or just the promise of seeing heritage bulls up close. A local congressman's aide stopped by and listened to my story carefully. A camera crew from an investigative YouTube channel with over 1 million subscribers showed up, interviewed me, and asked if they could film the bulls. I said yes and handed them a folder too. While people toured the ranch, a group of children gathered near Thunder's pen, watching him chew lazily under the sun. An older woman walked up beside me and said softly, "You're fighting for something bigger than bulls, son. You're fighting for what's still real." But Clarissa wasn't done. The next day, while I was unloading feed from the back of my truck, 2 uniformed men approached me. They had matching tan shirts with embroidered patches that read Desert Oaks Compliance Enforcement. Their badges looked legit at a glance, but I knew better. I asked if they had ID or any official authorization to be on my land. One of them said they were acting under HOA authority. I asked again, did they have legal jurisdiction here? One of them muttered something about community protection codes, but I held up my phone. "This is being recorded," I told them. "State law says you are trespassing unless you can provide a lawful warrant or proof of jurisdiction." They didn't answer. They just turned and walked back to their black SUV, clearly rattled. I reported the incident immediately and forwarded the footage to Max. "They're ramping up, Carter," he warned. "They're hoping to provoke you slip up and get arrested or sued," so I stayed calm. But inside, my blood was boiling. Clarissa had now created her own fake enforcement squad, complete with uniforms and badges. She was building a mini-regime under the guise of HOA compliance. And it was only a matter of time before someone got hurt. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint noises around the barn, but when I'd go check, nothing would be there. I was beginning to feel hunted. I set up a motion-triggered alarm system and reinforced the locks on the barn and front gate. At 3:14 a.m., the alarm went off. I ran outside with a spotlight and found a shadowy figure crouched near one of the fence posts. As I shouted, they bolted into the darkness. I found bolt cutters and a torn HOA banner nearby, like they were planting evidence. I handed it all over to the sheriff, but there were still no arrests. The next morning, the HOA posted an alert on their community bulletin titled "Local Livestock Emergency." It claimed there had been another escape attempt from the ranch and urged residents to contact HOA security if they saw cattle on the road. I wasn't even angry anymore, I was in disbelief. She was fabricating a crisis now, but the tide was turning faster than she could plug the holes. A local podcast picked up my story, and a lawyer from the State Agriculture Board reached out personally, offering to file a formal complaint on my behalf. Then the final straw arrived. A certified letter from the HOA demanded I attend a mandatory zoning violation hearing at the community center. Clarissa had scheduled it without legal authority, claiming it was a public safety forum. Max told me to go, but not alone. "Bring the press," he said. "Bring the truth with you." So I did. I showed up that night in my work jeans, boots, still dusty from the field, holding a binder under one arm and a folder under the other. The community center was packed. Clarissa stood at the front in a silk suit, hair perfectly done, behind a podium surrounded by two of her fake officers. She started the meeting with her usual show slides of manure, exaggerated maps, manipulated graphs about livestock transmission zones. She was on her way to a full meltdown when I finally stepped forward and held up a document. "Clarissa," I said loudly, "do you deny this is your cousin's signature on the developer proposal for the Wickenford expansion project?" Her face froze. The room went silent. I passed copies to the audience. "Do you deny this HOA is trying to forcibly remove protected heritage livestock in order to lower my land value and sell it to your cousin's firm?" She tried to interrupt, but Max, who was sitting in the third row, stood up next to a county official. "These documents are part of a formal complaint now," he said, "and the state board has been notified." One of her fake officers moved toward me, but two sheriff deputies stepped into the room behind him. "Not tonight," one said. Clarissa's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Then, like a punctured balloon, she sat down in silence. Outside, as people poured out of the meeting, someone patted me on the back. "That was brave," they said. I didn't feel brave. I felt tired, but I also felt something else. Momentum. The truth was finally out, and Clarissa knew it. She might have started this fight, but it was clear now I was going to finish it. The fallout from the zoning hearing was immediate. Clarissa tried to save face with a hastily written letter to the HOA board, claiming she had been misled by bad intel and that her enforcement actions were taken in good faith. But it was too late. The board was already splintering. 2 members resigned within days, and a third called for a vote of no confidence. Residents who had once silently complied with her edicts began speaking out publicly. A retired couple named the Bennetts posted on the community forum that Clarissa had fined them $400 for planting wildflowers not listed in the official HOA color palette. Another family admitted that she threatened to report their teenage son for urban graffiti after he painted a mural of a desert landscape on their backyard wall. The stories poured in, and with every one Clarissa's credibility collapsed further. The county zoning office launched a formal review of her enforcement history, and state agriculture officials opened an investigation into HOA interference with federally protected livestock. But the victory was bittersweet. Even as her power weakened, Clarissa escalated the threats. Anonymous letters started showing up in my mailbox, typed unsigned, always delivered at night. One warned, "You may have won this round, but the land is still vulnerable." Another read, "They're watching. Don't get comfortable." It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind them, but proving it was another matter entirely. I hired a private security consultant to sweep my ranch for bugs and hidden cameras. He found a small wireless transmitter hidden near my front gate, disguised inside what looked like a broken sprinkler head. The range suggested someone had been listening in on my conversations for weeks. That night, I replaced every camera on my property with encrypted models and installed motion-activated lights along the fence line. My peaceful ranch was starting to resemble a military outpost, and that reality sat heavy on me. I never wanted this fight. I just wanted to raise the bulls, keep a promise to my father, and live in peace. But Clarissa had turned my dream into a battlefield. Meanwhile, Max was still digging. He'd discovered that Clarissa's cousin wasn't just a developer. He was also tied to a lobbying firm that specialized in converting agricultural land into residential zoning. That gave her a clear motive for everything. If she could drive me off my land and get it rezoned, they stood to make millions. We compiled everything into a report and sent it to the state attorney general's office. But they warned us that it would take weeks, possibly months, before any formal charges could be pursued. In the meantime, I had to hold the line. Came the night I'll never forget. It was just past midnight when thunder let out a deep, unfamiliar bellow. I jolted awake and grabbed the floodlight, racing toward the barn. As I approached, I spotted two figures in dark clothing cutting through the perimeter wire with bolt cutters. One of them was holding a long case too big for a toolkit. I shouted and the figures bolted, dropping the case as they ran. I chased them halfway to the tree line before they vanished into the darkness. When I returned and opened the dropped case, my hands went cold. Inside was a tranquilizer rifle and several vials of sedation serum. The implication was chilling. Someone had come not just to vandalize or intimidate, but to steal one of my bulls. I called the sheriff immediately and they collected the case for evidence. But I could see it in their eyes. They knew this was beyond typical HOA drama. This was organized, targeted, dangerous. The next morning I posted a statement on social media with a picture of the rifle and a warning. I will defend this land, these animals, and the truth, no matter what it takes. The post went viral. Thousands of shares, national ranching associations, heritage livestock groups, even a few environmental watchdogs reposted it. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing alone. Clarissa tried to counter the growing backlash with a press release filled with vague denials and claims of being a misunderstood community leader, but nobody was buying it. The same day her statement went live, someone leaked the HOA's financial records to a local journalist. The report showed gross mismanagement of funds, including several payments to companies that didn't exist. One of them, listed as Security Logistics LLC, had been paid nearly $10,000 in 2 months. The address led to a P.O. box registered under a fake name. Clarissa was drowning, and her panic was showing. Her loyalists began distancing themselves rapidly, and within a week, the HOA board voted to suspend her pending the outcome of the investigation. But that didn't mean I was safe. The same black SUV I'd seen weeks earlier returned, this time creeping slowly past my property 3 times in one night. I called the sheriff, but they couldn't do much without proof of trespassing. I began to sleep in short shifts, my phone next to my bed, a flashlight and sidearm within reach. The stress was taking its toll. I lost 15 pounds in 3 weeks, and my doctor warned me about blood pressure spikes. Even thunder seemed to pick up on my anxiety. Standing closer to the house at night, pawing at the dirt near the barn door like he was guarding something. But amidst the chaos, there were bright spots. Tamara, the elderly neighbor who had once brought hay as a sign of support, organized a community potluck in my honor. She called it Longhorn Day. Over 100 people showed up. They brought pies, cornbread, hand-painted signs, and even gifts for the bulls. A local band played old country tunes while kids ran around the pasture. Thunder let one of them feed him from a bucket, and the child squealed with joy. It reminded everyone, including me, what this land was really about: family, history, tradition. Clarissa had tried to poison all of that with her schemes, but it wasn't working anymore. People were waking up. The tide was turning, but I knew I still had one last storm to weather. A week after Longhorn Day, I received a court summons. Clarissa was suing me for public nuisance and defamation. The charges were ridiculous, built on fabricated complaints and doctored video clips, but it meant I had to appear in court and defend myself. Max and I prepped for days. We collected every bit of documentation, every witness statement, every clip of Clarissa's HOA speeches and social media posts. I walked into the courthouse in boots and denim, my hands shaking but my spine straight. Clarissa sat at the front in another immaculate suit, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked like they charged by the syllable. But when the judge asked for evidence of my alleged nuisance activity, all they could produce were grainy photos of cow dung, a few angry neighbor statements that had already been recanted, and one highly edited video that showed me shouting, but not the part where I was responding to an armed trespasser. When it was my turn, I laid it all out: the rifle case, the harassment, the financial fraud, the fake security contractors, and most importantly, the forged developer connections. The judge listened carefully, nodding often. At one point she stopped Clarissa's attorney mid-sentence and said, "Are you aware that the property in question is federally protected and registered as heritage livestock habitat?" His answer was a stammering, "We dispute the classification," to which she replied, "Then you haven't done your homework." When the hearing ended, the judge dismissed the nuisance claim with prejudice and referred Clarissa's countersuit for further investigation. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered, many holding signs that read things like "Save the Longhorns" and "Respect Real Ranchers." I didn't speak, I just nodded, too exhausted for celebration. I'd survived another round, but Clarissa wasn't in the crowd. She had disappeared before the ruling was read aloud, and that made me nervous, because when people like her vanish, it's never the end. It's usually the calm before something worse. For a few days after the court hearing, things were oddly quiet. No SUVs passed by, no fake citations landed in my mailbox. The phone didn't ring with anonymous threats, and for the first time in weeks I was able to sleep through the night, without waking in a cold sweat. But I didn't trust the silence. It felt too calculated, like a predator crouched in tall grass. Sure enough, the calm shattered 3 days later when I found a red laser dot dancing across Thunder's forehead. While I was checking the gate one morning, my heart stopped. I followed the beam and caught sight of a man in tactical gear crouched behind a hedge near the road, rifle steady in his arms, scope aimed at my most prized bull. I shouted, and he bolted, but before he vanished, he yelled back something that froze me in place. "You were warned. This is the HOA's final notice." The audacity, the insanity of it. This wasn't harassment anymore. It was domestic terrorism. I immediately called the sheriff's department, and for once, they took it seriously. Deputies arrived within the hour and began a formal investigation. Treating the rifle threat as an attempted act of animal cruelty and unlawful use of a weapon, I handed over every piece of footage, description, and even previous threats. But despite the seriousness of the crime, the man who aimed the rifle was gone. No trace, no license plate. Just another ghost in Clarissa's crumbling empire. That the event was the breaking point, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. News spread like wildfire that someone had tried to assassinate a federally protected animal. The local news ran the story in their evening broadcast, and a larger outlet picked it up the following morning. Now Clarissa's name was associated, not just with fraud, harassment, and corruption, but with violence. Several residents organized a town hall demanding her permanent removal from the HOA board. She didn't show up. Rumors flew that she'd left the state, possibly gone into hiding while legal fallout began closing in. But I wasn't celebrating. Yet there was still too much to clean up, too many wounds in the community, and I had one more promise to keep. With Max's help and the support of the agricultural board, I petitioned to have my ranch officially listed on the Arizona Heritage Conservation Registry. The process was grueling: inspections, documentation, federal verifications, but after weeks of review, the application was approved. My ranch was now a legally protected conservation site, immune to zoning reclassification and HOA overreach. Clarissa's schemes, no matter how persistent, could never touch my land again. Word of the designation brought an entirely new wave of support. I received letters from history professors, veterans, ranchers from out of state, and even a few kids who'd watched my story unfold online. Some sent drawings of Longhorn bulls. Others included small donations to help cover feed costs. But the letter that meant the most came in a plain white envelope from a man named Hal Whitman, a retired Marine living 2 states away. Inside was a photograph, black and white, worn at the corners of a Longhorn bull standing next to a wooden fence. On the back he'd written 1954, my father's last bull before the drought. I cried the day he sold him. Thank you for keeping them alive. You've done what most wouldn't. I stared at the photo for a long time. The pride on Hal's father's face reminded me of my own dad, the quiet reverence they both carried for something bigger than themselves. It was never just about the bulls. It was about the soul of the land and honoring the people who lived by its code. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to rebuild. Clarissa's name was removed from all HOA documents. Her cousin's development firm pulled out of Wickenford entirely, and the remaining board members voted to restructure the HOA with community oversight. No more secret enforcement units. No more fake fines. Transparency replaced fear. I still kept the cameras up around the ranch. Still kept the gates reinforced, because some things, once threatened, never fully lose their scars, but the tension eased. Neighbors who had once avoided me now waved when they passed. A few even stopped by to chat or ask about the bulls. Thunder became a local icon. A 3rd-grade teacher brought her students for a field trip. One kid asked if Thunder was famous, and I said, "He's more than famous, he's a survivor." Max eventually took a job offer in Phoenix, but we stayed in touch. He never took a dime for his help, just said, "You had the guts to stand up." I just held the flashlight. I finally repaired the old barn roof, something I'd been putting off during the chaos, and installed a small sign beside the entrance, dedicated to those who stand their ground. Tamara visited one afternoon to drop off another bundle of hay. She lingered at the fence, watching the bulls graze in the golden afternoon light. "You did it, Carter," she said softly. "You didn't let her erase us." I nodded, still unsure how to describe the strange mix of relief and grief I felt, because as much as I'd won, there had still been a cost. My trust in systems, my peace of mind, even my body still recovering from sleepless nights and near constant stress had all been pushed to their limits. But I was still standing, and so were the bulls. As for Clarissa, word eventually came through a legal contact that she had been indicted on multiple charges: misuse of HOA funds, conspiracy to commit fraud, and interference with protected agricultural operations. She faced fines, restitution, and possible prison time. But I wasn't waiting for her verdict to feel closure. That came on a quiet Sunday morning when I stood beside Thunder and looked out across the pasture, the sun rising over the hills, the smell of earth and hay settling around me like a warm blanket. The land was safe. The fight was over. And for the first time in a long time I felt proud not just of surviving but of keeping a promise. Not to a government agency, not to a board, but to my father, to my roots, to the quiet dignity of a man who believed in something real. I reached out and rested a hand on Thunder's broad back. He turned his head slightly, snorted, and went back to chewing, calm and powerful. That's how I knew everything was going to be okay. I had spent 3 years building a quiet life on my ranch in Wickenburg, Arizona, far away from the noise of the city and the rigid control of suburban life. My name's Chase Reynolds, a 34-year-old software engineer who works remotely and poured his entire savings into a dream that felt bigger than himself. I didn't just buy land. I invested in legacy 180 acres devoted to preserving one of the rarest breeds in America. Texas Longhorn heritage bulls. Only 300 of them remained in the entire country. Each one tagged and certified as federally protected heritage livestock. They weren't just animals to me. They were living monuments, carrying the genetics of a breed that helped build the frontier. Every morning started the same way, coffee in hand, boots on the ground, and 15 bulls grazing peacefully under the desert sun. It was a simple life, but one that tethered me to something real. That all began to unravel the morning Sandra Whitfield arrived in her gleaming white SUV. I remember the moment she stepped out, late 30s, platinum blonde hair, a white business suit far too delicate for ranch dirt, and an air of superiority, so thick it might have choked one of my bulls. She sprayed perfume into the air the second she caught the scent of livestock, shielding herself like she was walking through a war zone. "I'm Sandra Whitfield, chairwoman of the Desert Oaks HOA," she announced, her voice sharp and theatrical, like she was playing a role in a courtroom drama. "You need to move these animals somewhere else." I blinked at her. "Ma'am, you're on my private property," I said, keeping my tone calm. "These bulls are registered, federally protected heritage livestock. This is their legal and rightful home." She frowned, like I'd just insulted her purse. "You don't understand, Mr. Reynolds. This area is being upgraded. Your creatures are bringing down property values and creating an unsafe environment for our community." She pulled out her phone and began snapping photos of the bulls and the surrounding land, muttering something about documentation. I pointed to the federal plaques mounted on each pen, the official tags in the bulls' ears, the documentation displayed proudly at the entrance of the ranch. She didn't care. "Rules are rules," she said, waving her gloved hand like royalty dismissing a peasant. "And in this community, I make the rules." The last thing she said before strutting back to her SUV was chilling. "You'll change your mind. Chase, I always get what I want one way or another." That wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of war, and she made good on it fast. The very next morning I woke up to flyers posted all around the surrounding neighborhood. My ranch's address was listed alongside bold claims about dangerous livestock posing health hazards to the community. They called my bulls diseased, claimed they threatened children, and urged people to call the county health department. I was on the phone half the day, trying to explain to bewildered officials that my animals weren't just clean, they were part of a protected federal program. The vet records were in order, the bulls were healthy, but Sandra had already lit the match. By noon, a health inspector showed up at my gate. The man was polite but confused, clearly annoyed that someone had filed a formal report that wasted his time. He took one look at the documentation and apologized. "Sorry for the hassle, Mr. Reynolds," he said. "Someone clearly has an agenda." That agenda got louder. Sandra had a massive vinyl banner installed right across from my driveway. "Luxury neighborhood cleanup campaign protecting property values." It was positioned perfectly to shame me. Visitors would drive up to see majestic bulls behind a fence and a giant sign suggesting I was contaminating the area. I watched from my porch as she directed the crew, dramatically pointing at my bulls while talking to someone on the phone. I'd had enough. I drove into town and had my own sign made, "Heritage livestock protected by federal law." I installed new security cameras around the perimeter and wired a small public address speaker near the gate. The next time she came by, I flipped on the PA system. "This is cattle country, folks, not a spa." The real kicker came when my lead bull, Thunder, took it upon himself to send a message. While Sandra posed next to her banner for photos, Thunder wandered over for his afternoon drink and relieved himself right on her sign. The sound alone made her shriek like she'd been shot. I didn't say a word, just kept working like nothing happened, hiding my grin behind a hay bale. A few minutes later, an old neighbor, maybe 70, with a limp in his step and a sparkle in his eye, came walking up. He rested his hands on the fence and watched the bulls for a moment. "I once drove across 3 states just to see a real longhorn," he said. "Kids today think hamburger comes from a grocery store. Don't let them erase this, son." The moment hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just about me anymore. Sandra wasn't attacking a man with car, she was trying to erase a part of America. The next morning I found a wooden sign leaning against my gate. We stand with the bulls. That same day, 4 more popped up along the road. By noon, a veteran from the next town over dropped off 2 bales of hay and said, "Consider this my war bond." The community was waking up. Word had started to spread. This wasn't about property values. This was about something real, something people could feel in their bones. That night, I dug deeper into Sandra's background. What I found chilled me. She'd done this before. 6 months earlier, she had orchestrated a similar campaign against a family-run chicken farm on the other side of town. Flyers, reports, intimidation until they sold the property to a development company for pennies on the dollar. Same playbook, different target. She wasn't just a neighbor with strong opinions. She was a calculated manipulator running a hostile takeover, targeting anything that didn't fit her manicured vision of luxury life. Around 8 p.m., my phone rang. It was her. "Chase, honey," she said, her voice syrupy and insincere. "I hope you know your little signs won't save you. I have other methods and I'm not afraid to use them." Then she hung up. No threats, just promises. Her voice still rang in my ears long after I'd hung up. That night, as I walked past the pasture and saw Thunder standing under the moonlight, I promised him I wouldn't back down. The days that followed felt like living inside a psychological war zone. Sandra didn't back down. She doubled down. Flyers started showing up again, this time with more aggressive language, accusing me of hiding unlicensed animals, suggesting my bulls had attacked a child, and demanding urgent community action. I knew none of it was true, and so did many of the people living nearby. But when you bombard a neighborhood with enough fear, some folks start believing the noise. A few residents started avoiding eye contact when I drove by. One family even changed their morning walking route to steer their kids clear of my front fence. It was working. Sandra's smear campaign was chipping away at my credibility and isolating me. Then came the so-called Emergency Community Safety Forum, an event Sandra hosted at the local community center, which she had transformed into something resembling a courtroom drama. There was a raised platform, a podium with her name printed in bold serif font, and a projection screen behind her. She'd invited HOA members, neighboring development residents, business owners, basically anyone she could manipulate into showing up. About 60 people packed the room. She kicked off the meeting with dramatic images of manure piles, out of context aerial shots of my ranch, and graphs that made no logical sense but looked terrifying enough to stir anxiety. "We have a serious problem in our community," she began in a tone that mimicked an emergency alert broadcast. "Mr. Reynolds' operation is not only unsanitary and dangerous, but it's also driving down property values and creating unsafe conditions for children." She kept calling my bulls, that facility, like they were barrels of toxic waste, not federally protected livestock. I sat quietly at the back until I couldn't take it anymore. "That manure you're complaining about is worth more than your entire PowerPoint," I called out, rising from my seat. A few people chuckled, but Sandra's composure cracked slightly. I took out my phone and started broadcasting live. "Folks watching this online, this is what an HOA tyrant looks like. Watch how someone with too much money and not enough respect tries to erase a living piece of American history." Viewers poured in. The comments were flying, people defending agricultural rights, veterans recognizing the heritage value, even ranchers from other states expressing solidarity. Sandra's face flushed. "Mr. Reynolds, stop recording. This is a private community meeting," she barked. "I'll stop when you stop slandering federally protected animals," I replied. She was thrown off completely, stumbling through her next slides while the comments from my stream exploded in real time. Then, as if the universe wanted to weigh in, my 15 Longhorns, led by Thunder, appeared outside the community center. Someone had left the gate unlatched, and the bulls, curious as ever, decided to stroll over and investigate the gathering. Thunder, majestic and calm as a monarch, nudged the unlocked side door open with his enormous horn and casually walked into the room. The crowd erupted in gasps and scattered chairs, but Thunder didn't care. He calmly walked past Sandra's podium like he was evaluating the quality of her arguments. He didn't stomp, he didn't roar. He just walked in like he belonged. Kids squealed with delight, taking out their phones for photos. One little boy ran up and touched Thunder's horn with both hands, looking at me with wide eyes. "Mister, is this a real cowboy bull?" he asked. My voice caught in my throat. "Yeah, buddy, he's real. He survived more than most people ever will." The boy smiled like he'd met a superhero. Adults started chuckling. The tension broke. Sandra's message about danger and decay fell apart like a house of cards. "This isn't dangerous livestock," someone whispered nearby. "This is incredible." Her entire argument collapsed under the weight of one child's awe and one bull's majestic silence. Sandra tried to salvage the situation by yelling over the chaos. "This is completely unacceptable. This ... this proves the danger they pose," she snapped, pointing toward Thunder. But no one believed her anymore. She had just lost the crowd. I gently guided Thunder back toward the door with a firm pat on the shoulder and a soft command. He obeyed instantly, The same bull she'd painted as violent and unmanageable had just walked calmly into a crowded room, made a kid's day, and left like a diplomat. As I stepped outside with thunder, several people followed me into the parking lot, asking questions, shaking my hand, even apologizing for being misled. I had no idea, one woman said. I thought you had a bunch of aggressive livestock, but that animal was ... noble. I thanked them and kept my responses short, still high on adrenaline and disbelief. Back inside, Sandra grabbed the microphone one last time, her voice shaking with rage. This is not over. From Monday forward, I will be hiring professionals to deal with this situation once and for all. The word professionals echoed through the room like a threat, and I felt it in my gut. This wasn't just a battle anymore. She was gearing up for war. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on my porch, watching the moonlight reflect off the backs of my bulls. Thunder resting near the fence, chewing his cud like nothing had happened. But I knew Sandra wasn't finished. She'd been embarrassed in front of her entire audience, made to look like a fool in her own courtroom. People like her didn't take that lightly. They retaliated. I started researching what kind of specialists would someone like Sandra hire. Animal control? No. Too slow. Legal? Unlikely. Nothing about her moves so far had been legal. My mind darkened with a more chilling thought. A hunter. Someone who could be convinced my bulls were dangerous wildlife. It would give her distance from the crime and someone else to blame. And then I saw it the next morning. Parked outside the local diner where Sandra often hosted informal HOA meetings, a black pickup with Montana plates, hunting stickers on the bumper, and a rack in the back that held a rifle case. Inside, through the window, I spotted Sandra seated across from a large man in camo gear. He was flipping through documents while she gestured toward a map. The pit in my stomach turned to stone. I paid my bill and drove home fast. When I checked my security system, I noticed several cameras in the north pasture had gone dark. Someone had either disabled them or moved them just enough to create blind spots. This wasn't random, it was coordinated. My ranch wasn't just under attack anymore, it was under siege. The day Thunder died was the day something inside me snapped. I couldn't let Sandra get away with this, not after what she had done to my bull, to my ranch, and to my community. That same night, Brett sat with me on my porch, staring into a cup of coffee like it held answers to questions he didn't want to ask. The man who had once arrived here confident and sure-footed now looked hollowed out, devastated by the realization that he had been used to kill a federally protected animal. Mr. Reynolds, he said quietly, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. His voice cracked, and I could see the weight of guilt bearing down on him. She lied to me. She made me believe I was doing something good. I didn't know. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a villain, but a man wrecked by the truth. You didn't know, I said, but now you do, and you can help make sure she never does this to anyone again. Brett nodded, a solemn promise in his eyes. That night, we began collecting everything: emails, text messages, maps, forged documents. Every shred of evidence he had, we catalogued. Brett had kept it all, not out of suspicion, but from habit. He was meticulous with paperwork, and now it was going to save my ranch. The next morning we met with the sheriff's deputy who'd responded to the shooting. He listened intently as Brett explained how Sandra had contacted him through a national hunting forum, disguised herself as a wildlife control official, and commissioned the job with phony documents and fake permits. She set up entire websites, phone lines, contact numbers, Brett told him. I even called one of the numbers to verify the job, and someone answered pretending to be with the state wildlife office. The deputy's eyebrows rose with every word. That's a level of fraud we don't see too often, he said. It's premeditated, and it crosses state lines. You may have just handed us a federal case. That was exactly what I hoped. Sandra had pushed too far. Her operation wasn't just HOA harassment anymore, it was interstate conspiracy, falsification of government credentials, an accessory to a wildlife crime. But I knew Sandra wasn't going to crumble with just an accusation. We needed something undeniable, something public. So I proposed a plan. I'll call her, I said. I'll pretend I've given up, that I'm ready to sell the ranch and leave town. She'll show up, thinking she's won, and when she gloats, we'll catch her confession on tape. It was a risky move, but Brett was on board. He even volunteered to hide in the brush near the porch with professional-grade audio recording gear. I set up hidden cameras and prepped my phone for a live stream. If Sandra said anything damning, the world would hear it in real time. We rehearsed every angle. The next day I made the call. Sandra, I said, forcing my voice to sound broken. I can't take this anymore. I want to sell. You win. She paused, then responded with the fakest sympathy I'd ever heard. Oh, Chase, I'm so sorry to hear that, but I do think it's the right decision. I'll be by tomorrow afternoon with an offer you'll find very attractive. Attractive, my ass. She meant predatory. She thought she had finally broken me. What she didn't know was that this was her final move, and it would backfire in spectacular fashion. That night, Brett and I set the stage. Hidden microphones, backups on the cloud, cameras positioned to capture every word. By morning, The porch was wired like a movie set. Brett took his place in the brush, and I sat on the porch with a cold coffee and a stack of fake legal forms, pretending to review her coming offer. Around noon, Sandra's SUV rolled up the driveway. She got out looking like the queen of the desert, all white linen and designer sunglasses. Her leather folder clutched like a weapon. "Chase," she said as she approached, "I know this has been tough, but you're doing the right thing. You'll feel better once this is all behind you." She laid out the paperwork, including a purchase offer for half of my land's market value. "This is a very generous deal, considering everything," she said, "especially with the negative publicity surrounding that unfortunate bull incident." My jaw clenched, but I kept my mask on. "Can I ask you something?" I said, gesturing to her documents. "What exactly did you tell Brett to get him to come here with a rifle?" She chuckled. "Oh, please. I told him you had wild animals on your land and refused to cooperate with safety measures. I sent him those permits I made. You saw how official they looked, right?" She laughed again. "He bought it all, hook, line, and sinker. The man thought he was doing a service. Can you believe that?" I stayed silent, letting her keep talking. "And Thunder? That was unfortunate," she said with a casual shrug. "But 1 down, 14 to go. He was just a cow. Chase, get over it." That was it. I stood up and pointed to my phone. "Sandra, you've just confessed to conspiracy, forgery, and fraud. And over 300 people are watching this live right now." She froze, mouth open. Brett stepped out from the brush, holding his audio recorder. "And I've got everything," he said calmly. "High-quality sound, already uploaded to the cloud." Sandra's face turned from triumphant to terrified in a matter of seconds. "You can't do this. This is entrapment. You tricked me." "No," I said, stepping back as the sheriff's cruiser pulled up the drive. "You tricked yourself." The deputy exited the vehicle, walked straight to Sandra, and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Sandra Whitfield, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, forging federal documents, and being an accessory to wildlife crimes." "No," she screamed as he led her to the car. "You can't do this to me." But it was done. The woman who had terrorized a community and killed a piece of living history was finally being taken down, and every second of it was broadcast to an audience that now understood exactly who she was. Sandra's arrest was the turning point the entire community had unknowingly been waiting for. The woman who once strutted through town like she owned the land beneath our boots was now behind bars, facing charges that included conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of federal documents, impersonation of wildlife authorities, and accessory to the unlawful killing of a federally protected animal. Word of her downfall spread like wildfire. The video of her confession had been shared thousands of times online, and it wasn't just local residents watching. People from across the country weighed in with disbelief, support, and outrage. News outlets started calling. First local, then regional. They wanted interviews, footage, statements. I gave them what they needed, not to chase fame, but to make sure Sandra's kind of evil couldn't quietly rebuild itself in the shadows. The fallout was immediate. The resort development company that had quietly backed Sandra's vision for cleaning up the area released a public statement disavowing her entirely. They canceled all pending contracts and, in a rare display of corporate conscience, pledged a donation toward heritage livestock preservation. Sandra's mansion went up for sale within a week of her arrest, but no one wanted it. It sat there empty, a white elephant perched atop the desert bluff like a ghost of its former arrogance. But as Sandra's empire crumbled, something beautiful began to rise from the dust. I used the restitution awarded by the court over $2 million to expand the ranch. New fencing, new barns, and a full-time veterinarian joined the team. Brett, who had been offered full immunity in exchange for his testimony, became my head of ranch security and logistics. He was a changed man, not out of fear or guilt anymore, but because he had found a cause worth fighting for. Every day he walked the pastures, checked the security systems, and helped guide school tours, making sure nothing like what happened to Thunder would ever happen again. And Thunder, his story became legend. Every tour started with it. Every visitor heard how one bull's death led to the survival of the others and the rebirth of a ranch that was nearly erased. Children would gather around the memorial stone we set near the pasture gate, a large slab carved with the words, "In memory of Thunder, protector of the past." They'd ask questions. Some of them would cry. One little girl once placed a daisy beneath the stone and whispered, "Thank you for being brave." That kind of reverence didn't come from rules or fines or tidy HOA policies. It came from truth. And that truth spread. Donations began to pour in. People from around the country who believed in preserving rural history and heritage livestock reached out to help. Schools booked field trips, colleges requested partnerships. The Federal Department of Agriculture even sent a delegation to recognize the ranch as a national model for heritage conservation. Meanwhile, Desert Oaks transformed. After Sandra's arrest, the remaining HOA board members either resigned or were voted out. A new chairperson was elected, an older woman named Ruth Harding, a retired librarian with a deep respect for the community's agricultural roots. Her first act in office was to repeal every fake ordinance Sandra had ever created. She personally visited my ranch with a homemade pie and an apology. "We should have known better," she said. "We let ourselves be ruled by fear and vanity, but not anymore." Slowly, the neighborhood mended. Neighbors who once kept their distance now stopped by with smiles and support. Some even volunteered to help with the educational programs. They wanted their kids to understand the history Sandra tried to bury. They wanted them to see animals not just as nuisances or threats to curb appeal, but as living connections to something greater. Brett's redemption became something of a local legend, too. He told his story openly during tours, admitting his mistake and explaining how easy it was to be manipulated when you don't ask the right questions. His honesty struck a chord, especially with the kids. They saw in him a man who took responsibility and chose to stand on the side of truth when it mattered most. There were hard days still, of course. Running a ranch isn't easy, no matter how popular it becomes. And sometimes I'd look out at the field and expect to see Thunder there, standing proud at the edge of the fence line, watching over the herd like he used to. But he wasn't there. His calves were, though strong, stubborn, beautiful creatures, carrying his blood and his legacy. I named one of them Liberty. Another I called Echo, because every time he snorted, it sounded just like thunder. One morning, I walked out to find Liberty standing at the same spot Thunder used to frequent, horns wide and steady, eyes fixed on me like he was saying, "I got this now." And he did. They all did. The herd was safe, the land was protected, and the people who once turned their backs had become allies, all because one arrogant woman tried to erase something she couldn't understand, and in doing so, made it stronger than ever. Sandra may have come to the ranch with her perfume and her lawyers and her fake permits, but she left in handcuffs, defeated by truth, legacy, and the unwillingness of a single man to let go of what mattered. And that, to me, is what America should be about: not bending to pressure, not selling out for convenience, but standing your ground, even when the whole world wants to pave it over. The seasons changed, but the impact of what had happened never faded. Thunder's death had marked a turning point, not just for me, but for the entire community and even beyond. The ranch, once a quiet sanctuary for a rare breed, was now a national model for agricultural heritage and preservation. We began offering internships for veterinary students, history majors, and conservationists. Local kids volunteered in the summers, mucking stalls, brushing bulls, and soaking up lessons in history more powerful than any classroom could offer. The national press picked up our story, and I found myself speaking at agricultural conferences, sharing how a single act of injustice had sparked a movement to preserve what others considered disposable. Brett, once the man who unknowingly pulled the trigger, became a kind of folk hero in his own right. His full-circle journey from misguided mercenary to protector of legacy showed people that redemption was more than possible, it was powerful. We had him lead our new security and training programs, teaching other ranchers how to safeguard their land, their livestock, and their legacies from similar threats. What had started with deception and bloodshed was now becoming a blueprint for resilience. Tour buses became a regular sight on our dusty access road. Teachers brought students from as far as New Mexico and Nevada. At first, I worried the attention might change the spirit of the place, but it didn't. If anything, it amplified it. Thunder's spirit lingered in every corner of that ranch, in the proud stance of his calves, in the laughter of children learning how to clean a feed trough, in the quiet way visitors would stop and lower their voices near his memorial stone. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch with Brett after a long day, watching the sun set over the Arizona horizon. "You know," he'd say, "Sandra thought she was going to bury your ranch, but all she did was plant something stronger." He was right. Sandra's trial had been swift and brutal. Her recordings, the evidence of her deception, and the public backlash left her defense team scrambling. The federal judge had little patience for her attempts at excuses. When the verdict came down, 3 years in federal prison, $2 million in restitution, and a lifetime ban from any HOA leadership roles, there wasn't a soul in the courtroom who questioned it. She was escorted out in cuffs, not a trace of her former smugness left in her stride. The restitution money had been a blessing. It allowed us to hire more help, expand the barns, and triple our pasture space. But it was never about the money. It was about the principle. Sandra had tried to rewrite the rules, to replace dirt with marble, authenticity with control. She failed because she underestimated what heritage really means. It's not about perfection. It's about permanence. Thunder's legacy, once threatened, now ran deeper than ever. His son Liberty became the new leader of the herd. He had Thunder's stubborn streak, his bulk, and his unshakable presence. Tourists took photos with him, and he always posed like he knew exactly what was expected. Echo, the other bull, became a gentle giant who loved the sound of kids singing. He'd press his head against the fence whenever school buses pulled up. I started hosting an annual event in Thunder's honor, Heritage Day. We offered free tours, live music, hayrides, and storytelling, and every year without fail someone would cry while listening to Thunder's story. Not because they were sad, but because they understood. In a world where so much gets paved over, sanitized, and rebranded, here stood a place where truth had roots. where an old bull's sacrifice turned a cattle ranch into sacred ground. Brett's parents came to visit one year, silent and proud. His father shook my hand so hard I thought he'd crack a knuckle. Never thought I'd see him settle down, he said, but if there's any place he'd protect with his life, it's this. Brett chuckled and said, guess I finally found a cause that matters, and he wasn't just a protector, now he was family. The new HOA under Ruth Harding's leadership became a model of integrity. She rewrote the bylaws, eliminating the arbitrary restrictions Sandra had abused. She attended every one of our community events, often bringing pies and lemonade for the kids. We forgot what this place was really about. She told me one day, standing beside Thunderstone, but you reminded us. The biggest surprise came from the Department of the Interior. A rep contacted us after watching one of our broadcasts and arranged for Thunder to be posthumously honored. They placed a historical marker on our property, one of only a few ever awarded to a living livestock site. The plaque read, in memory of Thunder, whose sacrifice preserved a breed, a tradition, and the spirit of the American frontier. Sometimes, when everything is quiet, I still walk that pasture alone. I stand where Thunder fell, where I once knelt in the dust thinking all was lost. But it wasn't, it was just the beginning. Because when you stand for something real, when you fight not for profit, but for purpose, nothing can erase it. Sandra learned that too late. She tried to buy her way into power, to silence the land's truth with paper and perfume. But truth has a way of speaking louder, especially when it comes wrapped in horns and history. I'll never forget the moment. A little boy on a tour looked up at me, wide-eyed, and asked, "Is this where the bull hero lived?" I smiled and said, "Yes, and now it's where his legacy lives on." The past isn't dead, not here. It walks the fields on 4 legs, etched in sunlight, whispered in breezes, guarded by those who remember. Thunder may be gone, but he's everywhere. And so long as this ranch stands, so long as we teach, preserve, and fight for what matters, he always will be.